I think workforce planning is really, strategic workforce planning specifically, is really turning into more of an operational workforce planning.
They don't often have the luxury to look up and look around and think about what is their existing workforce.
There's little harm in the lessons learned by that failure and more to be gained by the value of really quick innovation. And it's hard in this space. So if I could change one thing, that would probably be what I would change.
Money talks, especially in this kind of environment in manufacturing that has gone through a lot of change. It will continue to go through a lot of change. Good morning and welcome to this episode of Talent Talk. I am excited to bring this conversation to you with my guest today, Jaylene Cogswell. Jaylene is a Senior Director of Talent Acquisition, currently in the manufacturing space. Jaylene brings a depth of experience around TA and specifically analytics. So I'm excited to have this conversation around workforce planning, strategy, and those analytics that actually matter. So Jaylene, would you like to say a quick hello?
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We're excited to have you. So, hey, I want to just jump right in because previous conversations you and I have had have been so interesting and forward thinking. And so really excited to share this with some of our viewers here. So I want to talk about workforce planning with purpose. So let's start big picture. How are you thinking about workforce planning in manufacturing right now?
Great question. I think workforce planning is really, strategic workforce planning specifically, is really turning into more of an operational workforce planning. So I say operational workforce planning is taking over, in my opinion. I think long-term strategy is really too far out at this point. The world is moving too fast. Things are changing too fast. And so I like to think that our success in workforce planning is to focus on a shorter term outlook and really work on optimizing more of an agile operational plan.
So you've articulated a few things that have changed. What do you think is staying the same, if any?
So I think planning and analyzing your data and your workforce, knowing your workforce inside and out, really being able to understand what that looks like, where your gaps are, and what the external market conditions look like, doing some degree of scenario planning to really, understand what potential risks are. But most importantly, you still have to understand what you need and what you want and what your gaps are. And at the end of the day, if you don't know that, you're not workforce planning. But the question is just how far out are you trying to do that? And if you're trying to do that 3 to 5 years, like we used to when we talked about strategic workforce planning, that's not very realistic anymore. And businesses are changing too rapidly, particularly in the manufacturing space. I like to recommend, I think for true success, you really have to tighten up this process and this planning process within a 6 to 12 month outlook so that you can start getting some wins on the short term and you can really start meeting those demands and then being able to pivot for change.
One of the conversations we had before this was around the often perceived disconnect between the executive leadership and the operational leaders or, even the hiring managers on the shop floor, right? So how do you kind of balance that disconnect sometimes between those overarching initiatives and vision and strategy with what's actually happening day to day at the production level?
Great question. So first of all, this is a common, it's a common and unfortunate reality, right? Organizations, and it kind of boils down to first and foremost a communication gap. And I think our role as HR talent leaders, whether you're an HR business partner, a talent partner, you're leading a TA function, whatever that might be, your role is to help bridge that gap when it comes to understanding talent nuances. So that's kind of first and foremost. But really, when you think about the workforce planning element of this and talent strategy, your executives, for example, are generally going to give you a big picture ask that might look like we need to double our operators within X facility by 2028, right? That's your big demand. They're saying we have to meet this demand. They're giving you a ballpark number there. So how do you meet that when it comes to all the nuances that your operators and your lower level leaders are going to need is again through that operational workforce plan. So if you're redefining that long term, you're redefining those 6 to 12 months and trying to say, what is it going to take to get there? You first you're really turning it into more of an operational workforce planning, capacity planning, and absorption exercise at that point, which at the end of the day is going to meet the delivery of your operational leaders. It's going to satisfy them in a short term. And I'll get to the how in a second, but it's also long-term going to incrementally get you to where the executives are hoping to be. So it's a bit of a balance, but you have to, in the short term, understand what is that volume and what is that nature of work that you're trying to accomplish within the next, like I said, 6 to 12 months. What types of roles do I need? Not just how many, what are the types? How many are low performers, i.e., have potential terminations in front of them versus high performers. So they might be potential promotions. So that's kind of your movement of talent, creating gaps. Do you have anybody in lower level roles ready to move up? What's your readiness look like? What's the true gap that you need for those external hiring demand numbers? And then how long, and this is where you partner with those operational leaders to say, how long does it take to really ramp up in this role? You need to understand that time frame. And then how many, and then you back into those numbers with your target hiring demand. And that's ultimately, what you need to understand for that 6 to 12 month, meet the operational leaders where they're at. But then you can incrementally grow those numbers and say, okay, well, if we know that in 2 years, 3 years, we're going to have to be double what we're at right now, let's incrementally add headcount here where it makes sense. And as you incrementally, add that in, it becomes a math exercise, right? You're really kind of slowly building for the future. And in the short term, you're really making sure that you're supporting the absorption for those operation leaders. And you're not doing it too quickly. You're not pushing something on them, and you're still kind of meeting them where they're at.
I think the absorption piece is really, really interesting here, especially as you're talking about sustained growth over an extended period of time. Because I think oftentimes, at least operation leaders that I've worked with in the past, they're so in the day-to-day grind, right? They don't often have the luxury to look up and look around and think about, what is their existing workforce? Who might be retiring soon? Who are some of those kind of red flag employees that, might not be reliable for even the next month? And so to kind of give them that space to work through that, I really, really love that exercise. I've done things like 9-boxing in the past for some of those. Are there tools or strategies that you bring to that you've found particularly helpful in manufacturing?
Yeah, a lot of times your organizations are set up with a series of mechanisms that will give you some of that information, whether it's 9-box, talent planning, succession planning data, performance reviews, things of that nature. And so you can certainly, and you will want to use and leverage that. I found that when it comes to soliciting and assessing that data, I've sort of built my own toolkit over the years, which is essentially a series of questions, right? It's what do you need? What types of roles do you need? How many of those roles? And then you're really sequentially going through kind of what you have versus what you need. And you're asking questions about the state of the business. So you're baking in things like, what are your projected retirements for the year? What are your projected leaves of absences? What are your projected, turnover? And that's a joint effort. You're really partnering with them on that exercise. Pro tip is to keep it simple. You have to, ask these questions knowing don't make this a big to-do, a big workshop, a huge exercise. They don't have time for it. It becomes then an HR type of initiative, and you don't want that, right? That's where we see this fail and fall apart. And that's probably the biggest lesson learned from strategic workforce planning. It's such a wonderful methodology, but nobody cares or has the time to sit down with that length of activity. So keep it short and brief. Ask the questions that just get you the responses and the data you need that helps you get to that gap to goal, because that gap to goal is then what helps you execute from the HR side.
I like that phrase, gap to goal. I think
Yeah,
that's where the work happens, right?
exactly.
You are very driven by data, right? You are a data driven leader. I think I've kind of learned that about you. And I think that is the direction that TA has evolved over the past decade. It's every decision, every choice you make, how you go to market, how you source, right? It's all led by data. So I think we all know that in TA, there is good data and there is less than helpful data, or data that has just kind of been a part of the process for many years, but doesn't actually garner us the information we need to make the best choices. So, as we talk about data in talent strategy, what analytics are actually moving the needle for you? I know you alluded to this a little bit in your last comment, but what are you looking at regularly that helps you make smarter decisions?
Yeah. So for me, this really my approach with the best data to track is going to always come back to the fundamental. What is my business trying to accomplish? What are my leaders trying to accomplish? And I tend to break this down into three categories, whether it's cost, quality, or speed. And that general direction helps me understand what I need to be focusing on in terms of how I build out my recruiting operating model. And then, furthermore, how I track the success of that. I'm going to build out the metrics that are going to align and showcase whether we're doing well or we're not doing well in that area. So, I think that said, and we can get into that more later, but some of my TAHR peers won't like this, but I think in terms of what's trending from a macro market perspective, and actually moving the needle right now are cost metrics, right? And these are the tough metrics for our space in talent because we always struggle with how you quantify what we do. But cost metrics are really taking a front row seat right now in terms of analytics. If you want to talk about value proposition and how you're measuring something, what the business cares about is cost. So it is hard. It's hard for TA. When I say cost, it's a variety of different metrics, but I'm really talking about the value. What's the value of your function, your processes, and the work that you're doing relative to that business? So it could be cost savings year over year, month over month, looking at your budgets, your vendors, your resources, and how you're reducing the cost to the business overall. It could be cost avoidance. So even estimates here are really powerful, but look at the work that your systems, your processes, your teams are performing. And if you didn't have them in place, how would that work get done and what would that cost be, right? And then the difference there, that's your cost avoidance. That's really important, right? And that can help tell a great story. And then this is maybe the hardest one, but it's the marginal impact. So I know that's a very financy term, and we don't like that. We don't like that math, and there's a reason we all got into HR and talent. But really, I can't stress how important this is. Do a little education to get some financial acumen and think about that marginal impact. Everything we do has a cost associated to it, or is again avoiding certain costs because of the fact that we're doing it. Think about that relative to the business profitability and what impact that's having proportionately. It could be a few basis points, but that's an amazing story to be able to tell over time to your business. And again, it's showing value. You are showing how your work is not just people, culture, feel good, fluffy work. You're really baking that into marginal impact. So I think those things are really, really getting some good traction in terms of helping us have a seat at the table.
I think that makes a ton of sense, right? Money talks, especially in the kind of environment in manufacturing that has gone through a lot of change. It will continue to go through a lot of change. How do we continue to stay at the forefront of that and stay relevant? I want to pivot a little bit to talk about COE. So Center of Excellence, for people that might not know the kind of acronym there. You have done a lot of COE work. You've brought this into different organizations that you've joined. And I'm curious, how does that show up in your manufacturing talent strategy today? what is the magic or the secret sauce behind making a COE actually work for the business? Because it's oftentimes somewhat contentious or somewhat confusing for businesses that are not familiar with how this operates and why there are, benefits to it.
Yeah. Truly, this can be a very contentious, challenging spot. I think a lot of my peers in the industry are in, feeling like their COE is not appreciated, maybe not adding the value they're hoping, not being leveraged the way that they're hoping to be leveraged. Overall, my thought process in building these over the years, the lessons learned, if you will, is that the business has to want a COE and understand what a COE is, how they add value, et cetera. Your business, also your organization, has to understand and have the right operating model from their business perspective that supports a centralized strategy. So first and foremost, if you are building a COE from the ground, or if you've been asked to stand up a COE, you should be asking some questions, even if it's in an interview process, of what the business operating model looks like and if they understand and value what that COE means. Because one of the biggest things that I have identified is that there's a lot of confusion between a center of excellence and a centralized shared service model. Right. And the two are very different. One's strategic and it designs the programs. The other is tactical and it responds to the day to day. So both create consistency, which is often what a business is looking for, but they're not the same thing. And the profiles of the people that build and lead these are often very different. So you get a lot of frustrated folks sitting in chairs that thought they were going to do one thing and then they're doing another thing. And so again, there's a communication with your leadership team and a clarification process, helping them to differentiate what the expectation is when it comes to a COE. So that's my first lesson learned over the years.
I think that's great. I love that you're asking that in the interview process too. How can I bring value here? What is the right way to make an impact and scale it? As we're thinking about the recruitment model, is one better than the other for manufacturing, in your opinion? I know this is a kind of a hot button question, but have you seen success in both, or is someone is starting out as a new director of talent strategy for a manufacturing organization? What other tips or kind of lessons learned would you share?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the COE with talent acquisition, I've seen a lot of it become a hybrid, right? But and a lot of these, just by way of how HR organizations are structured, become hybrid. You could have an HR operations model or a talent management model that has a center of excellence teams or verticals, right? But there's still operational folks that are reporting into that. And TA is a great example of that. So a lot of times you have a TA function and they are still expected to bring programmatic strategy. But at the end of the day, we have to fill recs, right? We have to execute on open positions. So overall, building out, you've got to build out a foundation. You have to have a foundation that can execute, but you have to be able to differentiate. There's usually resources on your team that are going to focus on programmatic activity. And maybe that's just you as the leader. Oftentimes it is just you as the leader. And you're helping to design and build the processes, centralize things, standardize things, create strategic roadmaps. But you have to have that foundational team that's still filling requisitions and still executing against the operations. So, I think it's a bit of a balance there. Some of the things that I think that I'm seeing overall with recruitment models, themes are insourcing. Insourcing recruitment models right now is a big theme, and that could go back to that macro discussion around cost, right? That's why cost metrics are such a theme as well. I think there's a lot of emphasis on, RPOs, MSPs, staffing augmentation models have a great place. They do great things. Oftentimes they're implemented very poorly internally with organizations. And so that sets them up for, in no way, shape, or form is it their fault, but it sets them up for failure with organizations. You have a lot of waste, a lot of extra spend. So I'm seeing a theme with my peer groups of insourcing to reduce costs and increase some control and quality of what's happening on the recruitment side. So yeah, did that answer that question?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would love to ask kind of a one quick final question. I know we've kind of hit our time here, but I'm just curious. If you had a magic wand to reinvent any part of manufacturing talent strategy, what would it be? What would you change?
I would definitely change the appetite for change. So, and the open-mindedness. So, manufacturing, as we know, don't come for me, is a hard-coded industry. It's hard-coded by nature, right? Literally hardwired assembly lines, hard-coded in thought, repetitive in nature. So, you're doing the same thing every day by no fault of its own. It's just very hard to pivot and explore new ideas because talent and the workforce ecosystem changes so rapidly. It's so challenging to innovate, and you're often lagging the market with progressive strategy. So it can be tough. And if I could change one thing, I would love to have more appetite for more change, more progressive ideas, moving quicker in that space, and a lot more yes than no, right? A lot more saying yes than no. But this
Right.
is
What if it worked?
yeah, exactly. Right. Let's explore the possibility versus trying to first and foremost kind of prove that it won't fail. And I think, we're living in a world that changes so rapidly. There's little harm in the lessons learned by that failure and more to be gained by the value of really quick innovation. And that's hard in this space. So if I could change one thing, that would probably be what I would change.
I love that. Jaylene, thank you so much for sharing those insights with us. Super excited to share your learnings and experience with our audience. If anyone would like to get in touch with you to learn a little bit more about your strategy or any of the topics that we discussed today, how can they get in touch?
I think LinkedIn is a great way. Would love to connect with folks, hear about some of their different experiences and what they're doing. And I love solving problems. So if I can make some time and connect with folks and help brainstorm, I'm so open to that.
I am sure people will take you up on that. I know I've already taken you up on that, and been the recipient of some very valuable insights. So thanks again, and we'll see you on the next episode of Talent Talk.
Thank you so much.